All right, guys. Well, welcome to chapter two, where we discuss the nature and extent of crime. We're going to focus in this lecture on defining what crime is, talking about the different categories of crime, how we measure it on the national level through our reporting systems, what the strengths and weaknesses are of measuring crime, what our crime rate trends look like, what patterns of crime exist, and then we're going to talk about, in the end, chronic offending. Let's look first at talking about what crime is. So many times we get into a position where we believe that something is criminal simply because we're offended by the act or we find a specific action socially detestable when in fact it's not defined in that way. And in many cases, the way that we end up defining crime comes from several different viewpoints. The consensus view of crime really relates to society's view of behavior that needs to be controlled. And those views are going to vary from one community to the next, from one region to the next, and from one country to the next. A pretty good example of that relates to the use of alcohol. You remember that I talked about last week, in the northwest part of the state, it's not uncommon for parents to provide teenage children with access to alcohol in their own home because the social norm is one of alcohol use. We also see that in European countries as well. Another example relates to the legalization of marijuana. In almost every state in the country, except for Kansas, recreational marijuana is now considered to be socially acceptable, even though it's tightly controlled and is no longer criminal. That's because the majority of people within those specific communities or societies have agreed that's behavior that no longer needs to be taken care of. The conflict view of crime, however, deals with those who are typically more aggressive to people in power. So, people who are hypercritical of local governments, of state level governments, people who come from different social or racial classes that determine that their viewpoints are drastically different or even in opposition of the majority view. And the conflict view is one created, in a sense, the argument is that those in power define crime in order to preserve their own social and economic status. The interactionist view yields to the preferences of those who are in social control. So, in other words, instead of the conflict view, the interactionist view says, okay, this is the ruling class. These are the people who should make the determination of what is and what is not illegal, and we should follow them. Moral entrepreneurs are people who seek to control behavior. So we see moral entrepreneurs related to numerous different issues. Primarily, they are social issues that they find abhorrent or something that they want to see stopped or to desist and act in a manner to influence our legislatures to create a criminal code that shuts those things down. When you consider all of these viewpoints, it seems somewhat difficult to come up with a solid definition of what is and what is not a crime. What our text has come up with is that a crime is a violation of social rules of conduct interpreted and expressed by a written criminal code created by people holding social and political power, which is a factual statement. Our laws are created by a state legislature. They are the ones who define what is and what is not a crime. Law enforcement doesn't do that on its own. It requires an elected legislature to do that. And those people who are in political power were put there by the public in order to act on their behalf. So now that we've defined what that is, we also have a regular understanding that while something may be criminal, all crimes are different. None of them are ever the same. Typically, we categorize crimes by violence, by crimes against property, public order crimes, and economic crimes. Violent crimes are pretty self explanatory. We see that with gang violence, we see that with homicides, intimate violence, such as domestic violence or rape, and then hate crimes, which is a fancy buzzword in the media today, but and catches new definitions all of the times. But a hate crime is simply carrying out violence against someone or a particular social or racial class simply because they are within that class. Property crimes. Typically, we talk about burglary and larceny at this point. That's predominantly theft, burglary of homes, businesses, etc. Public order crimes. Predominantly, at least in Kansas, when we talk about public order crimes, we're talking about substance abuse crimes. And what's always interesting, and it's something that I've built my career on, is that you can find a direct nexus between substance abuse crimes and property crimes and sometimes even violent crimes. It's because the demand placed on a person, the chemical demand placed on a person when they are addicted to a substance will drive them to find whatever resources they can in order to obtain that next high. In other words, an addict may break into a house to take whatever goods they can and sell it to buy their next high. An addict may violently attack someone to take whatever cash on hand they have in order to pay for their next high. Prostitution, on the other hand, is sometimes viewed in other states as not a crime at all because it involves the consensual act of two parties. It's considered a public order crime and has for a long time, even though some people call it the world's oldest profession. But in most states, this is still considered an abhorrent act and is outlawed. Economic crimes. White collar crimes, we think of bank fraud, wire fraud, um, the Bernie Madoffs of the world who have pulled off Ponzi schemes and scammed people out of millions of dollars. But in reality, our biggest problem in the country related to economic crimes has to do with organized crime. And not just the mobs of old that we're used to seeing in movies or on TV shows, but in large part, the cartels that exist south of the border. Their sole function is for political control and capital gain, meaning they seek to make as much money as they possibly can in order to further whatever their political and powerful goals are. We see that influence in the United States today. As a matter of fact, you probably could not walk into a casino and not be able to recognize with training, be able to recognize people who have associations with the cartels that are laundering money from their drug transportation trade or even human trafficking trade, laundering it into the casino and coming back out with clean money to send back home. So, how do we measure it? We know how to define it, we know how to categorize it. How do we know how much crime exists anywhere? We can work off of perception. In fact, a lot of people do, and it creates a lot of political turmoil when that occurs because we might see what we believe to be abhorrent behavior when in reality it's not. And we have to rely on statistical information in order to measure things adequately. For decades, law enforcement agencies have relied on the Uniform Crime Reporting System that was developed by the federal government through the Department of Justice that includes all crimes that have been reported to law enforcement and any arrests that these officers make when they investigate crimes. The problem with the reporting system is this: every state has different definitions of what is and what is not a crime. And of those definitions on which they agree, they all classify them different, which changes the reporting thresholds. So it's typically an error ridden report because definitions don't always meet the national standard, or state legislatures have refused to change their definitions to meet the national standard. So some data isn't collected in some states in the same manner that it is in others. And this report is typically one that is riddled with errors. In other words, to meet the standard for the Uniform Crime Report, sometimes officers have to change the definition of what it is that actually occurred just to get the report submitted. That makes the data terribly, terribly inaccurate. It also only considers crime reported to the police. Crime occurs without the knowledge of the police every single day and at a rate higher than what is actually detected, which means we're not capturing through the UCR everything that occurs. So the next step would be to consider victims of crime and ask them to report. The National Crime Victim Survey does exactly that. It helps us to provide estimates of crime that's committed instead of crime that's been reported or even detected. The problem with this reporting system is over-reporting of crime, people recognizing or claiming victimization when a crime never actually occurred, under-reporting people who simply choose not to participate in the survey, And then, of course, sampling errors with the scientific method of data collection really make this report sometimes difficult to put a lot of credibility to. Self report surveys is always something that those of us in law enforcement tend to giggle about a little bit because self report surveys actually are asking offenders, typically incarcerated offenders, to talk about all of their criminal activity. Not the offense that they've been incarcerated for, but every offense that they've committed. And they don't ask them for specifics, the date and the time, who the victim was, etc. But they do ask them, have you ever committed a burglary before? How many cars have you stolen before you were caught? That data is not reliable at all. You have offenders who are going to brag um, and and magnify the amount of crime they've actually committed. You have some that will underreport. You have some that simply won't participate at all. It's also a reporting system that typically only focuses on juvenile offenders because the goal is to cease criminal activity within an offender. And our best opportunity to do that is when they're still adolescents instead of when they're adults. In order to work to become more accurate, the FBI has developed what's called the National Incident Based Reporting System, or NIBRS, which drastically changes the way that law enforcement reports criminal activity so that we can come up with a nationwide standard that answers questions better than what it does right now. It's designed to replace the UCR, and in fact, that change has been going on since 2021 from one state to the next. Kansas is not immune from that. The KBI at the state level is actually developing a system that meets this new standard, and we expect it to be launched just about any time. It expands crime categories so we can get more detailed information about what's being reported and what we're responding to. It does a better job of linking arrests to crime clearances. So instead of simply just reporting offenses and then maybe later categorizing an arrest, we're better able to link that, which means we can track offenders who are transient a whole lot better than we ever did before. It also includes all offenses committed with one incident instead of simply the most serious offense. The way that we report things now is if I detected or responded to an incident, determined a crime had occurred, in fact, determined that 3 or 4 violations of the law had occurred, the only offense that I'm reporting is the most serious offense that individual is going to be charged with. NIBRS will also create better links between the actual offense, the offender and their characteristics themselves, the victim and um, what made them more susceptible to becoming a victim, the property and type, and any other arrestee variables that we can consider that might help us look at deterring crime. We have to have reporting data in order to make rational and even tactical decisions or even strategic decisions as law enforcement leaders to move forward. So these reports, as much as we might like to poke holes into them, are full of necessary data that we have to be able to work off of. Um, some of the strengths and weaknesses about the system, though, is that we can't always draw conclusions or connections through mountains of data that exist. Sometimes we get stuck in a bureaucratic wheel of just simply entering and processing data to be considered later, but we don't always gain an ability to draw conclusions or connections. The hope is that NIBRS is going to be able to allow us to draw more informed connections and then draw better conclusions about causes of crime and put law enforcement in a better position to counteract that. That's going to involve tools such as crime mapping, some observational research. Data mining will be prevalent in today's society. We all live off of data mining, whether we recognize it or not. And it's going to help strengthen it and make it more adaptable over time. Now that we've talked about defining crime, categorizing crime, measuring crime, let's talk about what our crime rates look like now. Today, violent crime exists at a rate of about 369 incidents per 100,000 Americans, which is relatively low. It's lower than it has been in the last 15 years. Trends, and your text talks about this, is violent crime trends actually went up in the 90s coming out of the recession in the 1980s, and then it began to see a decline. there is a big connection economically to violent crime and the strength of our economy. And we can see that ebb and flow right along with our recession trends. Property crime today exists at a rate of about 2,200 incidents per 100,000 Americans. And that is a number that has remained steady. So instead of being on the decline like violent crime, property crime pretty much tends to stay relatively flat, even through efforts of law enforcement agencies to counteract it. Our trends are impacted by the age and the structure of the population. The younger the population, the more crime there's likely to be. It's absolutely impacted by immigration. That's not to call immigrants bad people, but when immigrants move into the country and they have yet to assimilate to our values, to our culture, and to our systems, they're living and working out of a culture and a system that they are familiar with. And remember, before we talked about the fact that what we see as normal behavior in the United States isn't the same as it is in other countries. And that failure to adjust largely impacts our crime rates. The economy, as I've already mentioned before, is a huge factor. The harder or the worse shape the economy is in, the harder it is for people to find secure jobs and maintain secure employment. It puts them in a position to sometimes commit crime out of necessity rather than out of desire. Substance abuse always fuels crime, always will. Even as our drugs of choice change and adapt over time, the desire and the demand to use it will never change. Cultural change also impacts our crime rates, and as our society changes over time, so does our view on not only what is and what isn't crime, but what is and is not acceptable behavior. When we consider crime patterns, there are a number of factors that we look at. And the reason we consider crime patterns is to, again, put us in a better position to deter crime and to control crime in the best manner that we possibly can. Studies and the data is clear that most reported crimes occur in the summer months when it's warm, people are out and moving. A lot of property crime deceases in the wintertime simply because it's too cold and people aren't out. However, person crimes, when we're all sheltered up together, do have a tendency to go up. You may or may not have heard of cops relate to the fact that domestic violence calls go up during the holiday season. And that's absolutely true. Just about every agency, even one as small as mine, can show you that our calls for domestic violence incidents almost double around Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. And largely, that's weather driven. People are cooped up and tied too closely together. Um, we see different crime patterns and trends between rural and urban environments. This has everything to do with population density. The more dense our populations are, the greater the opportunity for victimization is. And it's as simple as the more people there are, the higher the crime rate is going to be. Social class bears significant weight. Um, some of the indicators of geographic areas that are going to be impacted by crime because of social class, you can visibly see it. Deteriorated neighborhoods, a lack of an informal social control, i.e., a high gang presence, income inequality, and then, of course, a lack of resources within the community that put people in a position to remain structurally occupied. Highlighting chronic offending, and this is a section within the chapter that you need to spend some more time and attention with because it's part of the topic of your discussion post for this week. What we do know is that crime is typically an act of the youthful, not an act of those who are older. Most of our offenders age out of crime at some point. Our persistent offenders or our career criminals, however, choose not to. Studies have shown us, though, that chronic offending is a decision point made usually within adolescence, meaning we can see chronic offending become a determinant factor when someone is still a juvenile. Instead of ceasing criminality or changing a life or moving in a new direction, they dig down deeper and dig down harder into their decision to conduct criminal activity, and that continues um, throughout their life. Sometimes that's impacted by family trends. Some of us that have done this for a long, long time can talk about the fact that we have arrested um, a grandfather, a father, and a son. It's just a part of the environmental process that those people have been exposed to. This was just a brief high level view of chapter 2. Again, read the full chapter. Um, Take notes and highlight based on what you saw here in the lecture versus what you're reading in the book. And again, I look forward to seeing your discussion responses related to chronic offending and aging out of crime. Let's have a good week. Go get it.